Welcome everyone to our last session of InFocus 2022 APAC. Today's session, overcoming 3 common barriers to ship code faster. But as you can see, we changed the title a little bit to make it a little bit more fun and more realistic. And now it's tomorrow, if not now, better secure. Next, please. Your hosts for today are Daniel and I. Daniel Figucio is the field CTO for APAC at GitHub. He's passionate about the processes that drive the development of software. He believes that he's the world's worst coders, but I can tell you that he is one of the best who can get things done in a very short time. And doesn't matter what language it is. So this is my real opinion. His bio says a little bit differently, but I can tell you that's not true. Daniel he lives in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. And my name is Faten Healy. I'm a senior solution engineer at GitHub, based in Sydney as well. I have been at GitHub for a bit over 4 years now. In my previous life, I was a developer, support engineer, QA tester, consultant, all of these different hats that I used to wear. Next, please. Now, before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes for you. The first one is we've got the chat, which is at the top right-hand corner, where please get involved, say hi to us, tell us where you're joining us from, which city, which country you're joining us from. And as well, I've got my colleague, Adrian Lee, who's a solution engineer at GitHub, who will be monitoring the chat and helping us with the Q&A as well. Then next to the chat, you can see that we've got the polls. So during the session, we're going to make it a little bit more interactive. So we're going to process some polls through the session. So please make sure that you will cast your vote. And we've got the Q&A. So if you have any question to our speakers, to Daniel and I, please make sure that you drop them into the Q&A tab at the right-hand corner. Adrian will be also helping us with the Q&A. If you like what you see and you would like a deep dive or you would like to learn a little bit more about any of the topics that Daniel will be covering today, there's a big blue request a demo button at the top right-hand side that you can click on as well. And we will get in touch with you after that. I just want to give you a couple of tips before we get started so you can get a better viewing experience. So first of all, make sure that you are joining us from your desktop. We could recommend using Chrome, Edge, or Safari. Firefox will work as well with the most recent, with the latest version. If you aren't able to see the stream, try to refresh the page. Maybe if you've got some troubles, if you're on the VPN, try to disable it and refresh again. Try to click the link that you've got in your calendar invite and see if that will work. If all of that is still not working, we've got some help troubleshooting documents available under the docs. And we've got our partners from Goldcast who will be more than happy to help you troubleshoot the issue. Next, please. And now we're ready to start our session. Tomorrow, if not now, better secure. I'll pass it on to Daniel.
Thanks, Faten, and hi, everybody. I'm super happy to be here with you today for the Improved Forum for GitHub InFocus 2022. My name is Daniel. My GitHub handle is Afray. It's named after a World of Warcraft Night Elf druid that I used to play years ago. And I've been with GitHub now for, it's over 6 years, helping to build out our amazing team in APAC, starting with just 2 of us and then growing from there. It's so different nowadays. And on that note, I just want to give a huge shout out to the entire GitHub APAC team. You are all awesome, no matter where you are. And anyway, today, what I want to do is take a look at a few things you can do to kind of put you on the right path for success in innovating and improving your shipping speed, mainly to target those disruptors that are probably hitting your industry. And if you're one of those disruptors, then oops, hello. But anyway, once we've covered this off, we'll open it up for a bit of a Q&A and a chat. We might take a break at a couple of points through it. So are you ready? Of course you are. Let's do this. All right, let's go.
Let's do it.
All right. So we've all heard this a million times, and yet there are still many organizations that are facing upheaval from disruptors entering their space, and they just don't know what to do. We know technology plays a central role in the disruptor's ability to execute and out-innovate the competition. Now, disruption affects every industry and no company is safe, and it's happening outside of the traditional tech spaces as well. Banks, for example, have moved from in-person banking to ATMs and now to web and mobile banking. And more of us are dealing, with banking software, and we never actually talk to a person. And this change has accelerated in the last couple of years owing to the pandemic, right? And it is creating this self-reinforcing loop for businesses of just needing to keep up. And it's a repeatable recipe. Digital disruptors have realized that by shipping faster, not only can you deliver new features and bug fixes more quickly, you also get to learn faster than the market on what your customers like and don't like. They're using things like A/B testing methodology, feature flags to roll out new features. And they use data-driven approaches to learn from customer behavior which paths they should continue down. But it's important to note, though, that what we're starting to see happen is not just disruption from the startups, but also from the current incumbent leaders. We've got Target versus Walmart, Tesla versus Ford, PayPal versus Citibank. Now, I can't fix everything for you today, all right? But I can say if you focus on 3 very specific areas, you'll go a long way towards becoming more like the disruptors. So first, let's look at how your developers get onboarded much faster once you've gotten them, via hiring or reorganizations. And then we'll look at understanding what code you already have and where there's a lot of wasted effort duplicating the same functionality. And then finally, I want to touch on the area of, the time and effort it takes to remediate discovered issues, especially those that are regarding security concerns, both in your code and the code that you use, your open source supply chain. And then each time what we're going to do is we're going to look at the potential situation you may be in right now, what will happen if you do nothing, what an ideal state looks like, and how to start on the path to that state. So first, let's get everybody onboarded. Now, before I dive into that, though, let's do one of these fancy polls. So in your organization, how long does it take for a new developer to contribute successfully to production code? You've got a few options there.
I just opened the poll now, and the options are less than a day, less than 3 days, less than a week, less than 2 weeks, or way too longer. So far, it's not looking great, Daniel. We've got over 60% way longer than 2 weeks. Were you expecting that?
You know what? I wasn't, but here's the thing. I actually set this up to be a bit of a trick question. You should always be thinking way too long. All right. In other words, always think of ways to make things better. Never be satisfied with where things are at now. Always look at how you can make things better. So way too long is a great answer. So when developers first start working on...
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry? The poll's still on. So far, we've got 50% way too long. Yep. And we've got less than a week, 20%. As less than 1 day is only 7%. Less than 3 days, none. I know. So 7%. And so the highest percentage at the moment is way too long with 46%. I'll close the poll. Thank you all for participating. And if you would like to share with us any more details about the experience and how long, what are the blockers that are blocking the developers from contributing successfully in the chat window, please feel free to do so. I'll pass it back to you, Daniel. Thanks.
Cool, no worries. This was my first poll, so that was pretty awesome. I've never actually seen it work before. That's great. All right. So when developers first start working on a project, they need to be able to set up their development environment, for example, their laptop. And if they're new, there's a new system that has to be procured and brought up to whatever IT management standards are mandated, within your organization, especially for a new employee. And this can be a challenge nowadays simply because we all know about global supply chain issues. I waited 5 months for my replacement laptop, and I know Faten's got to wait for a lot longer. And then each environment, and then each environment for each project has to be established, and if there are conflicting requirements, for example, different Java versions or different IDEs, that becomes a headache to manage as well. It's not impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's annoying, right? So let's just assume we've gotten past all of that. All right, and we've got all of that set up. Then there's a lot more we've got to deal with. How does the developer know how to build, test, run the code? What if the developer sees something that they felt they should have been implemented, but for some reason it hasn't been? In other words, how can a developer understand the decisions that have been made to get to the code base in the state that it's in today? Now, if you do nothing to address these scenarios, you run the risk of the following, right? Developer onboarding time will not improve. That results in lost productivity, reduced flexibility in your new starters. The rest of your development team will need to spend more hands-on time with the new developer. This leads to more lost productivity, even possibly slowing down of your developer onboarding. Now, I'm not talking about mentorship programs, right? They're super important, right? What I am talking about is all that unplanned interruption that affects developer flow and all those kinds of fun things. You also end up with a general disconnection between the code and the reasons why that code, is written. And that's going to remain and probably exacerbate as teams grow. And without that alignment, developer happiness starts to decline. And again, without that alignment of vision, innovation becomes more difficult to achieve and shipping remains stifled. Now, looking at an ideal state, obviously it's the complete opposite, right? Where we have developers contributing productivity and with confidence, there are two things that stand out. Developers and IT need to spend as little time as possible setting up systems and development environments. And developers kind of have to have a consistent source of information about each project. And that is as close as possible to the source code. And it ranges from historical conversations all the way through to how to build and run and test the code and other important requirements for contributing. Now, I'm actually going to suggest some things to try in the reverse order to our situation list. The things that are easiest to kind of kick off and get some buy-in on: documentation, scripting, and automation. And then we'll deal with the big rock, moving your development environment to the cloud. So when we look at projects that are deemed successful, they generally provide excellent documentation for three different types of actors. You have your general public. They need to understand what the project is, what it does. And this kind of documentation is focused on driving new uptake. It's probably marketing documentation is a great way to describe it. You have your end users. They need to understand how to use and be successful with the product. This kind of documentation includes user manuals, examples, all of that kind of stuff. But then you have your contributors, and they need to understand how to contribute to the upkeep and the improvement of the product. From opening a bug or a security report, feature requests, all the way up to, contributing the actual code. And today we're interested in documenting for the contributor, the actor that's actually often neglected when it comes to suitable documentation. Now, projects normally have a README file or their equivalent on non-GitHub platforms. And this README file should be clear, simple, straightforward, consisting of the instructions on how to download, how to build, how to run, how to test, even how to deploy. But it should also be your project's constitution, is a great way to describe it. Your README file should not just be that set of instructions. It's a place to talk about your goals, your product vision, and your roadmap. And it helps new contributors to understand what your vision is and why. And it makes it far easier for them to align and contribute accordingly, and it sits right next to your code. And then the next thing I would say is get yourself a contributing file in addition to that README file. And this is where you explicitly tell new contributors how to get started. Now on GitHub, when you create a contributing.md file, when someone opens a pull request or they create an issue, they'll see a link to it. It reminds them to review the guidelines before publishing. Oops, let's just do that again, shall we? Oh, that was fun. I don't know what happened there, folks. And I've lost my slides where I am. That's all right. I'll get there. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
For some reason, my slideshow exited out of the screen.
Yeah, that's all right. Oh, here we go. That's
there we go. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So like I said, get yourself that contributing file in addition to the README file. Now on GitHub, when someone opens a pull request, they will see that link. And these contribution guidelines save time and hassle caused by, pull requests or issues that have to be rejected and resubmitted. And some useful contribution guidelines includes things like, code and testing conventions, branching and commit message conventions, recommendations for creating good pull requests, how to submit feature requests, how to submit bug and security reports, and even how to write the documentation. Oh, and something else just came to mind. Try and help new contributors get started by explicitly labeling an issue that is simple enough for beginners to tackle. Use a first-time contributor label. Now, as you do this, you may discover that one or more of your processes actually requires multiple and probably tedious steps to get through. And any process that ends up like this is a prime candidate for scripting, especially if there are common namespace scripts that you can set up, because they really help to get up to speed when maybe you're moving between projects. Imagine having the muscle memory to just run script/server to build and launch, the web app or some other kind of server, or script/test to run all those tests locally, or even script/bootstrap to set up your development environment. Now, there could be other useful scripts that you can provide as well, but generally these are great ones to get started with. All right, so let's have a look now at automation. Now, when people think of automation, especially when we talk about software development, we're talking about continuous integration and continuous delivery/deployment. And that's super important, but it's also possible to automate a whole bunch of other stuff as well. For example, when maintainers find problems in a pull request, they'll report back to the contributors will fix the code, and then the pull request gets merged. And contributors generally, they don't expect a merge of their code unless it works. So that's kind of okay. But things get a little tricky when a change works, but it violates some technical or documentation standard. And then often when giving that kind of feedback in these kinds of cases, there can be accusations of pedantry or personal preference or whatever it happens to be. Because generally, as human beings, we're more receptive to feedback from pedantic robots than we are from pedantic people. There's my code. Love it. All right. So my recommendation is to automate all the things, use automation, not humans, to enforce coding and documentation standards, and anything else that you've detailed in your contributing file as much as you can. And if you do this, you drop the emotional barriers to productivity by taking that human to human pedantic risk out of the conversation. And there's plenty of opportunity here. In this screenshot of GitHub pull request test results, I've highlighted 2 tests that actually check blog articles for inclusivity, as well as grammar and spelling. You could run tests to see if quoted URLs in your documentation are live and actually functional. And then also do not forget to celebrate first-time activities, such as the opening of a first issue or a first pull request from a new developer. And if you do that with a consistent automation, it avoids the risk of letting that celebration of a first contribution slip under the radar. You see, most people think of tools like GitHub Actions as CI/CD tools, but in reality, Actions performs an automation platform that can react to a whole wide range of events to enhance developer workflow and other productivity. So go check it out. Now, once you've hit that low-hanging fruit, documentation, scripting, automation, what else can you do to help developers, come up to speed? And this is where we start talking about finally moving the dev environment to the cloud. We've moved so many applications and services to the cloud. One of the last things that have actually managed to go over is the actual developer environment. Embracing the cloud to run databases in a container with non-production data, that's pretty straightforward. Especially if the configuration and bootstrapping can be done as managed as code. Use Kubernetes or Terraform, all of that kind of stuff. But what about the actual IDE? Now, some specialized cloud platforms out there, they can host a custom IDE for their own projects. Right? And then some people have looked at things like, well, let's use virtual desktops and move that to the cloud. But the problem with virtual desktops is, in reality, you're just shifting the problem. So what about the Visual Studio codes, the Eclipses of the world, where environments and projects can be quite varied in type and language? And the best way to get this up and running is to use something like a hosted cloud developer environment. There are several out there. We have one called CodeSpaces. It's probably as closely integrated with a source code management system as you could probably get. And these environments reduce time to set up, the dev space for new or transferring developers, And you can change it from hours or weeks down to seconds, right? And they allow developers to access like this consistent developer experience. Uses a virtual environment, they can access it from anywhere without cloning, installing dependencies, tweaking configurations, all of that kind of thing. And you get to reduce the churn related to those environmental issues. Like every time a developer says it works on my machine, you can get rid of all of that problems. Now, generally, you can access these in a web browser. Some, like CodeSpaces from GitHub, we allow you to connect from a local IDE, such as Visual Studio Code, if you need more of a hybrid model. Now, if you're looking for a tool here, I do have some recommendations. A good tool is going to provide you with a backing VM that's dedicated to that developer environment. So you can have a full terminal experience and allow for multiple machine types so that you can choose the kind of machine you need. Virtual CPU cores, memory, storage, that kind of thing. It can also allow you to open, share, and externally connect to ports in that environment for user experience testing, to showing what you have in progress at this point in time. And bonus points if the tool has a permissions model to help you restrict who you can open and share those ports with. Another important feature is to be able to support a one-time setup of dependencies, via an editable, descriptive JSON or Docker file-like mechanism. So they just need to be able to be defined once, but then deployed at scale as much as needed. And changes to all the environments simply require, an edit to a configuration file. And then finally, customizability is also important. And this allows developers to add functionality that they find useful as developers without breaking the environment. Visual Studio Code extension support is a great example of that. Now, if you're looking for a case study about how this can work, head over to github.blog. We actually moved our developer team over to Codespaces in August 2021, and you can read about everything that we went into there. Just head over to github.blog, search for engineering team Codespaces. Should be one of the top 2 or 3 results. And the GitHub codebase is now over 14 years old, right? So you don't have to be a new project to kick this off. And Clint from Synergy over in Western Australia sums it up well. What used to be a 15-step process is just 1 step, open Codespaces, and you're off and running. And with that, I think we might just have a quick break, see if we've got any questions or any comments. Faten, do you see anything?
There was a question around GitHub Actions, just the workflow folder under the repo, and Adrian answered that. Thanks, Adrian. From Rohit, but we can start our poll.
All right. Okay, let's go on to the next piece then, because I want to start talking about what happens once we've got our developers happily onboarded, right, and they're contributing code. So how do we deal with the problem of getting about 90% of the way through your sprint, only to find that somebody's already written the code about 6 months ago, and your team didn't know it existed? But before we dig in too much, let's do that poll.
I think it's a very common scenario. So I'm going to open the poll. Have you ever struggled to find out what code exists in your organization? And the choices, the options are never, occasionally, frequently, or way too often. So this one I'll expect to way too often to be the highest, but let's see how it goes. So far we've got frequently. I think it's very common where you start a project, or like you're new and you start working on a specific task, and then you'll find that maybe 50% of that task already been done that you'd have been able to reuse. So far we've got the highest occasionally. I'll keep it open for a couple of more seconds to give everybody a chance to vote. But it seems that occasionally so far is like 46%, frequently 37, 39. Never is the 3%, which is expected, right?
All right, if you've said never, then congratulations. Like, wow.
So far we have 2% of the audience who said never.
Maybe the 2% of the audience want to come up and present the rest of the session for us.
Yeah, we would love to hear back more about that, right?
Cool. So have we got more responses coming through?
Now it's going, so I'll give the end result, which is we've got 5% never, occasionally 39, 37 for frequently, and way too often 17%.
Way too often 17. Okay.
Now that you're talking, never is going higher even. Now it's 7%.
Because everybody wants to get on stage.
Everybody,
right?
yeah. So tell us more about it. The ones who are choosing never, maybe tell us more in the chat about your experience.
All right. So like I said, if you said never, then congratulations. But to be honest, this is another trick question. The true answers are never or way too often, right? If you've answered occasionally or frequently, then way too often is probably the answer you should consider.
I'll tell you an interesting use case, because it's a single developer. That's why never. Because it was just a single developer.
That's not cheating, but cheating. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it makes sense now. Thanks,
all right,
Lee.
folks. Thanks everyone for hopping in there. All right, so let's say, for example, you've got 2 teams. There's one producing an API, and there's another team consuming that API in, say, a dashboard user interface. Now, if you're a single developer, you'll never run into this, and great. And the consuming team realized that they need some kind of new API endpoint to meet a deadline for a feature ship, but it's not on the API team's backlog, let alone prioritize. So what can the consuming team do? Well, they've got three choices, right? They can wait it out. There's no effort required there, but it runs the risk that the functionality is never delivered. They can implement a workaround, but that could end up sitting somewhere where another consuming team that might need the same endpoint, they can't use it. They can't get at that workaround. And, the team have to maintain it. And it's likely that it's going to happen several times for different consuming teams. So there's a ton of duplicated code. That's not great, right? And then finally, they can also escalate to management. Now, that sounds okay, but it's diverting engineering talent to a non-engineering task of doing the escalation. And there's only so many times you can do that before you damage your credibility within the organization. And it's disruptive for the members, of the producing team, because it breaks their workflow and prioritization methods to have to deal with these, unplanned requests. Now, today I'm going to focus on duplication in code and effort and workarounds, but the others are important too to look out for, especially the escalation one. So by not choosing to act, you kind of run the risk of following. Firstly, code remains hidden, and that leads to that very area that we're trying to address today, of duplicated code. And that's going to hinder your ability to innovate and ship quickly. If you don't open up those communication channels, planning is going to become difficult. More work will become unplanned work. And that disrupts timelines, it interrupts developer flow, all of that kind of thing. And what you'll see is that teams may start blaming each other for the inability to deliver. Now, you're going to have some great talent, right? And that can be trapped inside a silo. And yet they have the potential to collaborate and provide expertise across other projects, but no one knows that talent exists. And so all of this leads to missed opportunities to share experiences and code, right, in order to improve the quality and improve the security, as well as it leads to this increasingly disconnected and isolated workforce. Now, in an ideal world, code is easy to discover and adapt for your own purposes. Cross-project collaboration, it allows for consuming teams to openly contribute the features that they require to be, into a producing team's code base. And that allows innovative new features to be built and released faster. Experts can be fully utilized because they can be everywhere. And the API team can now own the maintenance of that contributed code because it's been, contributed in a way that, it's gone via an approval process, and everybody's ensured that it fits in with the coding standards and the documentations and all that stuff that you automated in the previous step. So there's only one thing I really want to talk about here, and that is innersourcing. And innersourcing is the adoption of open source culture, principles, and workflows internally within a company. The quality README and contributing files, the scripting and bootstrapping and running servers and tests, all that stuff I spoke about in the previous section, all of that grew out of and became defining features of successful open source projects. And engineering teams get to organically grow, when demand requires it, in an environment where folks can contribute, their own required features to a code base in a well-governed manner. Teams grow when more features are required, and then they ebb back to the core team when they're no longer required. And code ends up being where it needs to be. Other consumers can more easily discover the code and take advantage of what already exists, and that reduces that risk of producing duplicated code. And then also keeping the discussions around the code as close as possible to the code itself, in issues, in pull requests. It provides greater transparency into that decision-making process. Now, this allows newer developers to understand why the code is where it is at today. Remember early on in the slide, I had something like, why don't we do blah, right? It's even possible that a new developer can bring a newer perspective to those older conversations. And by encouraging things like modularization, providing pre-built binaries and packages when it makes sense, teams get to focus on the quality and the security of their particular area of responsibility. Now, we've got data. We can prove this. We have the data that shows that when organizations bring open source practices into the organization, they can see a substantial increase in productivity from onboarding new developers to reducing that duplication of effort. So let's look at a couple of things from the Innersource world that can help reduce that duplicate effort and help you ship code faster. So firstly, make sure you're using a source code management system that gives you tiers of visibility for a project. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this, bear with me, but if everyone is globally meant to see your code, make it public. If everyone in your organization or enterprise is meant to see it and only them, make it internal. And then if you're working on your secret self-driving car project that only a few of you are meant to know about, then make your code private. Secondly, use one source code management system and preferably just one instance of it. You thought I was going to say GitHub then, but just one instance of one source code management system. Because doing so makes it far easier to find what you want. And if you want to customize that discovery experience, you can always slap an Innersource portal on top of it. And then finally, look at ways that you can link similar repositories so that folks can find related work. There are several ways to link like repositories. There are quite a few open source Innersource portals, I kid you not, that's what they're called, that you can take and adapt to your own use. Or you can use things like, if you use GitHub, you can tag repositories like in this screenshot. All right, this one is for the June fans. I wanted to throw that in there, so feel free to screenshot this. Hopefully you understand what it is. But one thing I've not mentioned yet is the fact that you have to get rid of your fear of failure if you want to innovate and ship faster. And Naresh here nails it perfectly when he says that by seeing each other's work, you can learn from each other. You can share and improve as a community, and you get the motivation you need to innovate further, but also faster. And with that, if there's any comments or do you have any questions to have a look at?
We have a couple around measures and KPIs, but I know that you'll be covering that later on, so we can skip that. But there's one interesting one about how much managers' familiarity with the code base is required, since that can help in making sure that not two people are working on the same thing and neither of them go implement something which already exists. So when you were talking about duplicate work.
Yeah. No, absolutely get it. So one of the things about inner sourcing is that if you do this right, it becomes part of your planned work model. So often people will talk about when you have an inner source model, you have the contributor and the trusted committer. And the contributor is the person trying to add the new feature to the code base. And the trusted committer is the person who has been authorized and trusted to make sure that it fits all the standards and they allow it to come in. But there's actually another role in inner sourcing. It's called the product owner or the maintainer or the manager and something like that. And what happens there is that they actually get together to discuss what is needed and where's the right place to put it in. System architects are also a really good example of this. So when you're actually implementing Innersource, it's not just about making your repos visible and turning on the automation. It's also putting in the right roles into place. And so if I'm writing that dashboard and I need something from the API team, I've spoken about it to my product manager, my owner, and they've had a conversation with the API team's product manager and owner, and they've agreed that this is planned work. And so it actually becomes part of your planned work mechanism from there on in. So, and that comes back to the manager's awareness of the code. Well, it depends where they are and what they're kind of doing from there. In some cases, yep, it's handy to do that. But like I said, if you set up Innersource correctly, you have people that are specifically designed to have that kind of communication pattern between them. Does that help answer that question?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel. I totally agree. And in addition, I feel like visibility as like what's happening across different teams will let the developers themselves try to find what they need somewhere else.
Faten and I have done a lot of work with people on Innersource and talking about all that kind of stuff. So
like having the it's like, as you mentioned, it's like the culture, the mentality, having that visibility, that open mind, not the totally silos between teams, because the developers themselves, they'll be able to find other developers from other teams who've done similar or same job, same maybe function or procedure, and they can work on that.
Yeah, a lot of people think that open source is ungoverned and chaotic and a wild west. It's not by a long shot. Successful open source projects are quite governed, and there are communication hierarchies and all of that kind of thing. And the same thing applies to Innersource as well. You're not just, like I said, you're not just making all your repos public and then turning on some automation to check the your pull requests and stuff like that. There's more to it than that. And there's actually a great website, innersourcecommons.org. Go and have a look over there. They speak about it, from a high level, just general pattern type conversations, all the way down to nitty gritty details. And they definitely talk about having that concept of putting the right roles in place, having people at the right level communicating with each other. Thanks, Faten, for putting that link out there.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat.
All right, so we've covered a little bit off, about how Innersource can help, reduce that duplication of effort. So let's now talk about one of those big four DORA metrics that you hear about, the mean time to remediation, or MTTR. And today we're going to drill down, quite specifically into remediation of identified security issues. And you might have been at the security session, yesterday, where they went into GitHub Advanced Security. I probably won't go that deep into product, but first let's have a poll. So how often? Oh, sorry, Faten, you're reading these. Over to you.
No, you can read it. I'll read the.
I'll do this one. All right, cool.
Okay.
So how often has your team worked long and hard on a new feature, only to find just before deployment that your security team discovers a vulnerability, and it substantially delays your release, because you've got to retool it, rework it, and so on. What options do we have, Faten?
We've got never, at least once, at least 5 times, or way too often. Way too often. And the poll is open now, so if you can please take a minute and share with us your answers.
I'm wondering if everybody's thinking I'm asking a trick question again, because I got way too often.
Way too often, actually. Yeah, it's probably the tricky part where all the polls will have the way too often.
Are people going to trust me?
So far, we've got at least once.
At least once.
The highest percentage, with around 48%.
Yeah, fair enough. Do we have any way too often? Do we have any angry people?
15% way too often.
Okay.
And 15%, around 15% never. But the highest one is the at least once. We've got around 50% now.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll just wait for you to close off and we'll take it on from there.
I will close it now that we've got 15% never, at least once 47%, 5 times 20%, and way too often 15%. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
What do you think?
This is not a trick question. Saying way too often might sound a bit mean, all right? But let's think about this from the mindset of continuous improvement, not blaming security for your woes, all right? But it definitely happens a lot, and it really gets in the way of people, being able to release code. But, security's doing their job too, and keeping up with security requirements and checks and coverage and all of that kind of thing today, it's getting hard. And it's getting harder as environments and DevSecOps pipelines change at an even faster rate. There's overworked developer teams. They become more stressed when security comes knocking on the door. And this breaks that, again, state of flow. And then it creates an us versus them approach to security. And then on top of that, the security teams themselves, they're also overworked, right? So your notification processes can slow down. I've got a customer in Australia. I'm not going to say who it is, but they've told me that it can take anything up to 6 weeks before a security notification gets back to the developer team, let alone when they get to start remediation work. And this is because a lot of the current security tools really were purpose-built for waterfall-based development. And it's that last step before deployment. And it often means that they kind of bottleneck, agile-based DevSecOps. And it's similar to the way we used to think about car manufacturing, right? We couldn't stop the production line. It was all down to quality control before it rolled off at the end. And if there was a problem discovered, then there was a lot of required retooling and delays. It was just completely inevitable. And these security tools, they're time consuming. They're not developer friendly, and they're often riddled with false positives. Now, these false positives are a real problem because as scanners, they lack the context needed to determine whether or not they're real vulnerabilities that expose risk, or are they being flagged incorrectly as alerts. And so DevSecOps teams are forced to waste all this time chasing down problems that they aren't relevant, or they may not even be there. And then on top of all of this, many security solutions built for DevSecOps introduce deployment friction, right? They're agents in a production environment. And they also lack a lot of breadth of technology coverage, and they can actually negatively impact application performance, start time, stability, can be affected by these agents. And given all of this, the challenge of actively, of security actively slowing down DevSecOps rather than bolstering it, it's reached this critical mass. It's lost time, it's lost money, and it's lost opportunity. Now, not only that, this gateway approach is yielding less than satisfactory results. If we look at the industry norm today, and what that data is telling us is that typically within 7 days of a vulnerability being identified in a repository, only 15% of those findings are getting addressed. And that number goes up to about 45% after 90 days. So just think about that for a moment. All right, time's up. All right, it's pretty rough, okay? Now, this is just about finding issues in the code you write. I'm going to deal with supply chain analysis a little later. In other words, the code you obtain versus the code you write. Now, again, by not shifting here, by not taking any action, you do run the risk of the following, right? You have increased pressure to move faster. It's going to be exacerbated by remaining stuck on tools that were never designed to be fast or agile. This is going to lead to friction between the security and the DevOps teams. That's going to lead to employee stress, decreased satisfaction, and ultimately you're going to have an increased turnover of staff. And when there's such a shortage right now of talent, this is going to reinforce a spiral of just falling behind your disrupting competitors. It could even be catastrophic. In turn, the ability to innovate and ship, it's only going to continue to remain low, but it could even go backwards. Now, DevSecOps programs that are well into this journey, and I'm not going to use the word mature here because mature kind of implies that you get to a certain state and that's it. You don't have to fix anything. And that's not the way to look at this, right? It's a continuous journey. You're always looking at ways to improve. But DevSecOps programs that are well into this journey, they're executing a full suite of application security automation. The reports and the user experience, they're focused on empowering developers and enabling developers to fix their code in the same way that they fix a failed unit test or a performance test. It just becomes second nature and they become awesome at it. Security teams are then seen as partners, right? They're not the final boss in this week's World of Warcraft raid. They become mentors and guides, and this true community grows around security, even to go so far as to become part of a vital part of any Innersource project that you might be undertaking. And then finally, an open source governance model. It allows you to understand and manage what open source software can or will be used. It helps developers clearly plan for what they need to create themselves. So let's look into this shifting left term that we've all heard about, and then we'll look at how you can improve upon and make secure the code you write and the code you use. So let's go and build security into the entire process, right? Go back to our car manufacturing example. This is similar to what Toyota did. It was revolutionary. They empowered any worker to stop the line and address a defect. And here we're letting automation stop the process at any point to enable a fix. And security during the development...
Sorry, could you say that?
Sorry, Siri. Security during development becomes no more of a headache than a failed unit test, right? And it promotes that same desire to fix in the hands of developers who want to care about their work, who want to produce quality code. And this also prevents the needle in the haystack approach that goes on right now. And it kind of helps keep up that developer velocity. Now, I'm showing a screenshot from a GitHub product again. I can't avoid that because I'm lazy, and these are far easier for me to put together, right? So just bear with me here. But everything I'm telling you here applies no matter what you use for source code management and security. Now, I'd rather it be GitHub because these Star Wars toys aren't cheap, but make sure your tool can find vulnerabilities in code as the developer pushes them to your source code management system, but before code is merged into the main branch or deployed in canary-style type launches. Look for a tool where the queries are not proprietary, or at least make sure you don't have to wait for a vendor-supplied software update containing new and improved queries, right? Open source query communities are for the win. And this is super important if you're part of an industry with unique standards. MISRA, for example, that's a set of guidelines essential in embedded systems, and AutoSAR is similar for the automotive industry. And then finally, it should all be about the developers, right? Bring the process to them. Have the results appear alongside their unit tests and all their other tests. Make sure they can see the results within their space, as close as possible with the code. Provide developer-centric explanations, sample code, and plenty of links to help them read and learn more if they need to. And the results of this approach will speak for themselves. Now, we've seen numbers for our product, GitHub Advanced Security, suggesting that the mean time to remediate jumps to 72% of issues being addressed during the pull request process, not days, not months. We're talking hours to maybe a couple of days, depending on how long a typical pull request lives inside your organization. All right, now, the next thing I want to talk about is securing your supply chain. because we see on average about 80 to 90% of code within most organizations is from open source. This is really important because developers do not want and do not need to reinvent the wheel. You know, that 10 to 20% that's left, that's the cool code. It's your secret sauce. It's where developers should spend their time truly building out that differentiation. And to compete effectively, you've got to use open source because that's what the disruptors are doing. But doing it without a plan for securing the dependencies you rely on is risky, right? You might not have great visibility into what you're using, how secure that code is, or if the license chain is inconsistent with your company policies. You know, supply chain security can be time consuming, but it's critical to increase your velocity. And this screenshot, another one, it's our Dependabot tool. It's what we have, you know, it's our response in this space. But no matter what you're using, once you have your environment set up, it's important to ensure that all the code you are developing or using is secure from end to end. And that includes your open source dependencies. Supply chain analysis tools, they work like this. What they do is they get notified through various channels of a vulnerability in a dependency. It could be the National Vulnerability Database or GitHub advisories. There's several other sources as well. And when they get notified, they start working to let you know. So if you're looking for a tool to help secure your supply chain, look for tools that, well, okay, great. They can alert you to vulnerable packages, but look for a tool that can automatically create a branch and open a pull request to bring your dependencies up to a more secure version. You'll be surprised how much this simple act will take the pressure off your teams. And you'll also have an automated, consistently applied update process for your dependencies that's going to work just like a developer. Opens a pull request, you know, changes the code, submits it to your CI/CD, all the tests run and everything passes. You just merge and away you go. Now, bonus points if you can also set these kinds of tools up to provide for general non-security updates as well, right? Because it just helps there. We always want performance. We always want our code to run faster, for example. And again, should be all about the developers. So if you can notify a developer when they're introducing a known vulnerable version of a package, you know, before that code is merged into production, the developer can go and update the version they want, or they can go find an alternative. It's no different to fixing a failed, you know, performance test or a, you know, unit test. And then finally, your tool should be able to pull from a large, rich pool of vulnerability data, including having multiple sources as possible. The National Vulnerability Database is a good one there. And knowing that the vendor is maintaining a team of both enterprise and community-based security researchers is super important. We do that, and we also provide an advisory database that's available to everybody, even if you're not using GitHub. And for repositories that we are permitted to collect data on and have the Dependabot security updates enabled, the mean time to repair, the MTTR that everybody wants, is down to 40 days. And that's still too long as far as I'm concerned, but it's way better than the industry. Now, I can't compare this to repositories on GitHub that don't have the features enabled because we respect your privacy. And if you don't turn the feature on, we have no idea whether or not you've got a vulnerability or not. But I can talk about industry metrics from Sonatype and SNCC. And they indicate an MTTR of months, right? Sonatype says that the MTTR from, you know, disclosure to patch in some projects can be 180 days. And SNCC has found for some projects to be more than 2 years. And just to hear this from someone else, Mercari is an e-commerce platform. They connect millions of people to buy and sell almost anything from fashion to toys, sporting goods to electronics, jewelry to shoes. And they realized a lot of benefit in shifting left and bringing these security scans and dependency scans right into the developer workflow, from reducing cost to fix right through to developer satisfaction and happiness, through to getting new features onto their sites out as quickly as they possibly could. And this method of securing their software and dependencies became such a natural way to work for them, they didn't really notice it anymore. They just do it. So folks, today I've covered a lot of ground, very short period of time, from helping new developers get started all the way how to secure the code they write and hopefully write it only once. I've tried to keep it fairly generic, but thanks for indulging me when I did drop some GitHub product names into the conversation. But even if you only get to do one or two things I've spoken about today, we really do believe that you're well on the way to becoming a disruptor in your own space. And with that, I'm going to sign off from the talky bits and let's talk about the forum bits. Let's do some Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Daniel. That was a great session and great topics to discuss, from Innersource to security to all. We have someone in the chat, not in the Q&A, but asking for some of the examples of open source projects. So I know
been
that
very
we've
successful.
got, yeah. We've got the Octoverse that we can share, but the first couple of projects that comes to mind.
Yeah, sure. So State of the Octoverse is a great one, Faten. If you can drop a link into that when you get a chance, that'd be awesome. That's basically a lot of the data that's driven what I've spoken to you about today comes from that report. The other thing I would look at, and it's rather kind of topical right now, is Twitter has a site, Bootstrap, I think it's called, and TWBS. That's an excellent example of how open source exists and does really well. They do things like have the first time contributor label. They do all of those kinds of things that we've spoken about here. And if you're looking for a great example, go and look at that. Another interesting site to look at would be the open source of Swift, which is the programming language for iOS. They have a very interesting Innersource model that when you have to fork it normally and then submit a pull request. But if you get 5 pull requests or something like that haven't required a massive amount of rework, you actually get invited to be a trusted committer, and you can actually directly contribute code. There's tons of examples out there, and they all do things different ways. So it's a little bit difficult to kind of cover all of them. Again, I would the Innersource Commons, I believe, also lists some successful ones as well. And again, they talk about the patterns that go, because you do have a few more patterns that go beyond just open source, like we spoke about before. The project managers talking to each other and things like that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much. I know that as like languages, all different languages, as well as like projects are, and from all the big companies are available as open source, from Microsoft, Google, Apple, Daniel spoke about Swift. They have Flutter as well from Google. So lots of projects open source that you can use. There was another question that we skipped previously.
Sorry.
No, I did it on purpose because we were still talking about Innersource at that time. Around any tips and tricks or to measure the KPIs before and after implementing DevOps.
Is this for because we broke it down into kind of, because we've got the 3 sections here. Yes. Do we want to talk about metrics for onboarding, or metrics around reducing the duplicated work, or the security metrics? What would people prefer? I mean, I can start at the top and go down, but we'll run out of time.
I'll say
We've only got about 8 minutes left.
About onboarding because we don't have lots of time, and I can see already we have another.
Cool. All right.
Another question.
We'll talk about onboarding then. So first thing I would say is don't fall into the trap of associating developer activity with developer productivity, right? It's a common myth, and there are some seriously undesirable outcomes if you're not careful. For example, developers often have to stretch to deal with some poor planning or implement workarounds in a bad system, something like that. That's extra activity. It's not necessarily productive though. They might have obtained a better engineering system or a better tool, and they're super excited and they're pushing hard at that at the moment because they're having a lot of fun. And that will also see a lot of, increased activity, but again, not necessarily productivity. So you've got to be careful that when you look at activity metrics, like the number of lines of code or, the number of commits that are made, they don't necessarily reveal what the real situation is. So don't use those in isolation. Look at a couple of other things. I would think about focusing on outcomes instead of output. This is pretty simplified, but think about things like, did the code written by the developer reliably do what it was supposed to do, right? And for that, look at the quality. Look at the reliability of the code, the absence of bugs, your ongoing service health, what happened when you deployed it. Look at the impact, look at your CSAT scores, your customer satisfaction scores. Look at your customer adoption and retention. Look at feature usage, for that particular feature. Was there any cost reduction by implementing those kinds of things, And they're the metrics that are really super important for you. How many lines of code a developer is writing means nothing really nowadays. The other thing I'd probably look at too is your new hire satisfaction model. You should have an employee onboarding roadmap of some sort, and you're using things like employee interviews and anonymous surveys. They're key parts of that experience. Have a net promoter score. is a good way to kind of get a feel for how successful your onboarding is. Look at your new hire turnover. You're finding that your developers are leaving after a few weeks or a few months because they're too frustrated. What kind of information do you grab out of an exit interview? I mean, these sound ugly, but it's really, really important info. Have a look at your retention rate. Now, let's say, for example, that you've got 50% of your employee turnover happens within the first 18 months of employment. Use that as your standard. So this is a slightly long-term measurement cycle. Look at what happens once you implement this, what your turnover rate, what your retention rate is after 18 months. The other things you need to look at are absenteeism. I think I've covered everything else. Turnover, employer net promoter score. Yeah, that's probably about it. Hope that answers that one.
Yeah. And as well, all of the data coming from GitHub, we've got APIs available for you to export the APIs and use them in any tools that you would like as well. So we've got, yes, thank you. So thanks, Daniel. There's a question not related to the session, but around redesigning the Find in GitHub website. I think he's referring to the code search.
The redesigning of what, sorry?
It says here redesigning the Find in GitHub website. So I think it's the code search. So we've got a beta at the moment. I don't think he's on the beta, but we'll be happy to add you on it. So if you would like to share with us your GitHub handle, we can grant you access to the beta.
For those who are not aware of what it is, we're having a huge focus right now on code search on GitHub. We've never been happy with it. I'll be honest, we've never been happy with it, and we're looking at ways that we can make it much better. And so we have an experiment. We'll call it an experiment for now. It's not a feature per se just yet, but it is an experiment that we would love to get some feedback on. So if you do get signed up for the beta, we do ask that you give us a lot of good feedback here, because we really want to make this top notch.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay, so if there's any last minute question, please feel free to add it to the Q&A. And if you're interested in the new code search, feel free to register and send your GitHub handle so we can enable it for you. And as Daniel mentioned, we'll be very happy to get some feedback so we can pass that to the product team to improve.
I see a question around whether or not the slides are going to be available. I'm not sure exactly what's happening there, but we will be making a recording of this session available.
Correct.
Right? So if you haven't managed to grab stuff now that you're interested in, you'll always come back to be able to kind of have a look at this again later on. I'm not sure exactly what we're doing with the slides right now.
Yeah, the session will be available straight after we finish.
Thank you, Carl. So, there you go. I picked a person at random that said thanks to me.
Okay, so before you go as well, next slide, please.
Next slide. Okay, let me just flip screens for a second. Thank you.
Thank you. As Daniel mentioned, thank you everyone for joining us. But before you leave, please, if you would like to have a deeper dive on anything that Daniel covered, from Innersource to security, anything that he covered, please feel free to press the request a demo button at the top right-hand side of your screen, and we will get in touch with you shortly. And lastly, before you leave, please take just a minute or two to complete a short survey about your experience with us today. So the link can be found under the Documents tab at the top right-hand corner as well, or you can as well scan the QR code available on the screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and hope you enjoyed our session today. Thanks, Daniel, as well.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody, and hope you had a fantastic InFocus. So awesome. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.